Thank you, David. Obviously, I have a big problem retiring. I've retired 3 times. It just doesn't seem to work out. That's all right. So what would I do if I were? I do want to say before I get off, because it's related to what we're talking about, Steve mentioned there are 88 essays in this book that's coming out next week, or it's apparently already available on Amazon. And the one with Ted Berry is one of my favorites. I had interviewed Ted Berry multiple times, and he told me a whole bunch of different stories, and we became very good friends. And about 5 years before he died, he had told me the story of his high school graduation. And so I wanted to do it for Channel 12. And I called him up. He was living at Evergreen at that point. I said, will you go with me, and we'll go down to the old Woodward High School, which at that point was SCPA. It's the old SCPA now. I mean, it's the one up and over the Rhine. And then we'll go over to Music Hall, where the graduation actually took place. So we went to the school and walked around, and I got him. You know, people who are older, like me, begin to tell same stories over and over again, and how do you break them out of that? Well, one thing is to take them into a new environment. So I took him into this old environment that he had been in. He told all kinds of stories. It was wonderful. And then we went over to Music Hall. And the issue in the 1924 graduation was that he had submitted, along with a number of other students, potential graduation valedictorian speeches, and his was chosen. Here was the problem. The tradition was the valedictorian and the senior class president would process in together. The senior class president was a white girl. It was impossible in 1924. So what they decided to do is they reran the valedictorian speech, contest. And they had to submit under pseudonyms, as Steve was saying. And he submitted under the pseudonym Tom Playfair. Now, Tom Playfair, some of it's obvious, but the other part of it was Tom Playfair was the character of in a series of boys' novels written by Father Finn at St. Xavier Church. And that was his corner to sell newspapers on. That was Mr. Berry's corner to sell newspapers as he was a kid. So he had gotten to know Father Finn, he had read the books, so he submits it under Tom Playfair. He gets chosen again. Oh, they got a problem. So now what they decide to do is they allow him to process in ahead of the senior class president. So they didn't come in together. So I had him walk, when we got to Music Hall, this was at high school graduation time. The hall was set up for a graduation the next day. There was a podium on the stage. Drapes were curtains were closed. And so I had him process in down the aisle. And if those of you who knew Mr. Berry, very dignified person. I mean, just held himself beautifully. He walks down the aisle. He walks up onto the stage, and he delivered his 1924 valedictorian address from memory. My photographer and I were in tears. Which then, because I knew the rest of the story from other interviews I had done with him, we had him sit down and we talked to him. Because the rest of the story is, when he left Music Hall that night in 1924, he walked outside and there was a black chauffeur there to drive home one of the wealthier families, and they had a chauffeur. And the chauffeur said to him, I hear a black boy gave, the colored boy, I hear a colored boy gave the talk in there tonight. How did he do? And I can tell you, every time I interviewed Mr. Berry about this, he teared up. And he said, his response was, he did fine. And I think, for him, he was summarizing his whole life. That story of struggle and doing fine encapsulated his entire life. And when he is talked about as the first African American mayor, yes, that's true, but that so misses who that man was. And if I can recommend to some future generation of historians, I would hope they get into the Urban League collection at the Historical Society Library. It is filled with Mr. Barry's papers. There's other papers up at UC. There is an incredible story to tell there. So anyway, that's a total aside, but it's about a charterite that we all know and love, and since you teed it up, I couldn't resist. Whew, all right. I'm not a very good unemotional historian. Okay. Many of you in this room, because you've been longtime charterites or just because you've been involved in city politics, know a lot about the origin story of the charter movement. And I don't want to just repeat what you said, but I want to try to put a lot of that into context. And so consequently, I'm going to try to organize it around a few sets of questions or observations, themes. First, what does the origin story tell us about early 20th century Cincinnati? Specifically, why did the charter reform, progressive urban reform movement emerge after World War I when in other cities across the United States, urban reform had already come? Why was it so late here? A second theme, what are the dynamics of leadership? It was in my bio that David read. I was the director of Leadership Cincinnati for 8 years, and one of the things I did was each month I wrote an essay for the class around the theme that we were working on, and trying to deal with the question of why did some people succeed as leaders, and how did they succeed, and how did failure take place? Because some people who should have succeeded, what they were after didn't work. What happened? So I'm very interested in that whole question of leadership. I'm going to thread that through today. And third, I want to ask the question if there's any messages, hopeful or not, about the emergence of charter in a century ago versus where you and I stand today in 2024. What's our situation? What lessons might we learn? How's the world changed at this moment? So anyway, let's get started. The fact that a urban progressive reform movement started in Cincinnati, that's in the early 20th century. That's no surprise. This happened all over the United States in a lot of places. Sometimes it happened within the existing two-party system, either inside the Democratic or inside the Republican Party. A movement started to reform whatever city you happen to be in. Sometimes it started because of a third-party movement, like charter. Third parties in American life, in political life, their role is to respond to something that the two parties, the dominant two parties, aren't responding to, aren't being attentive to, aren't being effective at. And the success of a third party is very strange success. They usually don't last more than 1 or 2 cycles. If they are successful, they may win a seat or 2 someplace, or more likely, they just draw off enough voters from one or the other of the dominant parties, and then one of those 2 dominant parties, they respond by changing what they stand for in order to draw those voters back in. And you get a change, and maybe the issues that spark this get addressed better, but not because the third party succeeds. And that's, of course, one of the things that is sort of surprising about Charter we'll come back to. For example, in 2001 in Cleveland, there was a urban reform progressive movement, and it elected Tom Johnson as the mayor on a platform of home rule, 3-cent streetcar fees, and fair taxation. 4 years later, Lincoln Steffens, the great muckraker, wrote in McClure's magazine that in Ohio itself was a tale of two cities. On the one hand, Cleveland, the best governed city in the United States, and Cincinnati, the worst governed city in the United States. So there was this great dichotomy. Now, the question is, why didn't Cincinnati, if in 1904 the national press is already pointing to it as a really problematic political environment, why wasn't there a movement similar to what was happening in Cleveland, for goodness sakes, or lots of other cities? Why wasn't it happening here? Well, Bill Balgan, who's now dead, in his doctoral dissertation, which, by the way, if Charter and the Season Good Foundation wanted to do something that was worthwhile, it was get this dissertation published. It's one of the best things that's been written about early 20th century Cincinnati. First 5 chapters are brilliant. And it's 2 volumes, big, it needs an editor, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, the point is, Bill Balgan argues that the real problem in Cincinnati, the difference in Cincinnati versus other East Coast and Great Lakes cities, is that Cincinnati fell out of the common American experience at the time. Beginning in the 1880s, there was what he refers to as a living Niagara of immigrants, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. If you know Chicago, if you know Detroit, if you know Cleveland, you know that there's all of these ethnic neighborhoods that emerge. And whether you're Polish or whether you're Italian or whether you're Latvian, there are lines in the street that outsiders don't recognize, but the people who live there did. And that influx of immigrants was seen by many people as problematic. And they had an impact on local politics. And to a large extent, in many cases, that drove the efforts of progressive reformers to say, we're going to clean up the government because it had become corrupt and trying to respond to these immigrants. This, in many cases, meant that the immigrant groups were going to lose influence, not gain influence. So this isn't a pro-immigration policy. This is not necessarily being friendly to immigrants. I don't want to make, but the immigrants were the spark. Well, Cincinnati, which was a great immigrant city in the mid-19th century, had fallen out of that. We no longer were getting that huge flow of post-1880s immigrants. We continued to get chain migration from Germany and Ireland of people who had already had family members here or the same town and they had a contact here. They continued to come. Now, that doesn't mean we didn't get some Italian Americans here, otherwise we wouldn't have La Rosa's Pizza. Doesn't mean we didn't get some Greek immigration. We wouldn't have Skyline. What would I live on? Of course we got some of those immigrants, but the immigrants have always gone to where the jobs were. And Cincinnati was no longer this boom economy. They went to the lake cities where steel and other heavy industries were developing very quickly. Detroit, especially with the automobile industry. So all of that meant that Cincinnati didn't have that push behind the need for a reform. So in 1921, the Cincinnati Times-Star wrote, proudly by the way, that Cincinnati was the most American city of the North. And that means we didn't have any of those problematic immigrants. Okay, this is not, again, this is not a positive statement. But we were bragging that we didn't have that. As a result, one of the chief drivers behind urban political reform just was missing in Cincinnati. Now, what happens is that World War I takes place. The United States enters World War I in 1917, and a lot of people serve in the military in various forms, and many come back and they've bought in to sort of the rhetoric and the imagery of World War I, which was saving the world for democracy. And they wanted to save Cincinnati for democracy. And for the professional class, a lot of them said, we got to try to figure this out. And one of the things that emerges is the formation of Cincinnati Association. Now, this was made up of a lot of lawyers. Sorry, Steve. A lot of lawyers, a lot of other people in the room, by the way. This was an educated group of people. In many cases, they were people who were graduates of the Ivy League schools. They came to it with a lot of understanding, a lot of drive, but they did not start out with the answers. They didn't have a formula for what to do in Cincinnati. They didn't have even a clear understanding of what the issues were. They needed to begin by developing a critique of the current situation. So they met every month and they invited speakers in and they debated the issues of the day. They talked about and then debated the issues of the day. Whether Music Hall should be torn down because it was a mess, how to design the A Street Viaduct properly, how to do all these different things, each thing discreetly being talked about. Now, I don't want to give the impression that these were just the most fantastic meetings in the world. All of us in this room have belonged to organizations that are very good, very wonderful, and hold really terrible meetings. And so Herbert Koch writes about after going to a Cincinnati meeting where Bleecker Marquette, the great housing reformer, spoke that night, and Koch's comment is, Marquette bored all of us. So it was just, but this is where sort of intellectually things begin to sort of get worked out. Okay. Then, just to put this into context, the political system that existed in Cincinnati really comes out of the late 1880s. The 1880s are a period of tremendous turmoil, period when where people lived, the whole movement out of the basin up into the hilltop suburbs, the new hilltop suburbs, that's all taking place. And that isn't just a physical thing, that's a social thing. That's people are segregating themselves, fragmenting. Middle class people are going one place, blacks are going one place, whites are going, there's all of this shift. It's the emergence of the second Cincinnati, by the way, but it's also where people worked was changing. The long recession of 1883 into the early 1890s was when industrialization finally hit Cincinnati. And Ross's Workers on the Edge is the greatest book ever written about Cincinnati. If you haven't read it, it's an absolute must. And so these twin forces of urbanization and industrialization, nobody knew, first of all, they didn't even know what was happening. They didn't have much of an understanding of exactly what was happening. They needed some system to control it. And what emerges in the late 1880s is a boss-style system. That's also very common. It happens across the United States. Somebody has to take responsibility. Somebody has to take charge. So if you've read Zane Miller's Boss Cox of Cincinnati, one of the things you come away with is bossism wasn't necessarily a negative thing at the time that it emerged. That's very hard for us to understand anytime post emergence of the charter, because the Charterite movement so slams and effectively denigrates the boss period that we can't understand, we can't stand in that midst in the late 1880s, the 1890s, early 2000s, or 1900s, and understand what was going on at that point. So, now, Boss Cox, this is a very different style of government. I mean, he ran the city because he had a telephone. That's what he said. That's what he told Lincoln Steffens. You know, I don't need to be in office. I've got a telephone. I can tell people what to do. He ran it from the Mecca Saloon, from his office above the Mecca Saloon. He ran it through ward bosses like Gary Herman and Mike Mullen. And by the way, although this gets labeled as a Republican organization, really it's a conglomerate. Cox basically brings the Democratic ward bosses and the Republican ward bosses in together. And so you end up with one party which has the Republican title, but basically what you've done is you've wiped out the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party ceases to function until the 1950s in any sort of meaningful way. So yes, we can blame the Republicans, but that's a little too simplistic. Now, Cox was around until 1916 and then finally gets displaced for legal reasons. But after the fall of Cox, Rudolf Heinecke becomes the boss. He's not very effective. He's not even here all the time. He's also running burlesque houses in New York. He's got other fish to fry. And the organization becomes less and less effective and efficient. It's not operating the way it did in the 1890s. And the basic point is, and this is Baldwin's point, it lacked any vision for the future of the city, and the organization was willing to risk nothing. The only thing it wanted to do was to stay in power and keep a minimal funding of the city operation going. It had no vision. It had no vision for the future. It had lost that. And what you get is just increasing the amount of inefficiency and corruption. So one of the great symbols of this is the contract that's let to repave 4,000 feet of Kellogg Avenue with granite paving stones, very expensive way to do a street, and it ends at Coney Island, which Gary Herman owned. So, I mean, it's all, you know, you're talking about out and out corruption. So if Cincinnatus and the professional group is operating over here on a sort of a, what do we do about this theoretically, the other force that emerges here is the press. Particularly important was the Cincinnati Post. Cincinnati Post was the afternoon newspaper. The other afternoon newspaper was the Time-Star. That was owned by the Taft family, and it was a Republican, and it was not very daring. The Post was. A lot of their readership, a lot of the people who followed the Post were people who worked second shifts and getting off at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, or first shifts, getting off at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they were picking up the newspaper as they left their factory or their place of work or whatever. And what the Post develops on both the news pages and on the editorial pages is increasingly a critique, beginning in 1920, of what's going on in Cincinnati and trying to hold the political organization to account. So Alfred Siegel writing under the pseudonym of Cincinnatus, so the image of Cincinnatus, sort of the namesake of our city, which isn't, that's another essay. But the image of the retired military officer comes home, lays down his military power to take up civilian power. Writing under Cincinnatus, he begins to really detail what's going on in the city. Now, in the hands of the Post columnists and their cartoonists, and when you go out, you can see some of the cartoons that are there. Cartoons are effective and very, I mean, they just get to the point. That's the whole nature of political cartooning. And we all, probably everybody in this room, remembers Jim Borgman and his ability to just summarize all complex issues into one frame in a way that brought it all home. So what the newspaper writers and their cartoonists hit on was the importance of the pothole. The pothole becomes the symbol of all the things that are wrong with city government at the time. And there's a series of articles written about a case where a man driving on Madison Road, which the newspaper said was similar to the bombed out battlefields of World War I in Flanders, he swerved and he killed 2 children. He was found not guilty because his argument was the roads were so bad he couldn't drive safely, and the jury found him not guilty. The irony is, one of his lawyers was the vice mayor of the city who had responsibility for the roads. Okay? So there's that. Then, in a series of tongue-in-cheek articles, which are just so wonderful, in 1923, they tell the story, and there's multiple articles here. They tell the story of a young woman and then her fiance who fall through a hole in Linwood Avenue, a pothole in Linwood Avenue, and end up in Bombay, India. Now, you know, when the woman fell through to Bombay, that was, you know, well, that was really concerning. But when her fiance falls through, now the people of Bombay are worried. You know, are they going to have to end up taking care of all these Cincinnatians who can't hold on up on the other side of the world? And people in Bombay organized in order to send a group to Cincinnati to teach them how to fix potholes. Now, this is the classic, you know, what do we have to learn from India, right, type of attitude. But here they're having to save us from ourselves. So all of this is going on sort of a professional level and then on a popular level. All of it shifts very quickly in October, basically on October the 9th, 1923. Cincinnatus, well, the city was running out of money. It was broke. It needed a new levy, an increase, not a renewal. They had already cut, I'm putting in some modern elements that, having reported on Channel 12 for years, I mean, trying to explain the difference between new levy and renewals. But anyway, they had already cut rations for the police and fire horses in half. And the answer was, they don't vote. What's the problem? And they also argued that the city needed all of this new investment. And could argue pretty convincingly that there really was a financial problem. So in October, on October 9, 1923, Cincinnatus sets up a debate representing the city was the head of the Republican Party, Leonard Smith, who was the chairman of the Republican Party, and he comes with all this data, all these charts, and to argue about the problem of the financial situation, and that the only way to solve this is by passing this levy. Well, representing Cincinnatus, they selected Murray Seasongood. Murray Seasongood had dealt with the organization a couple of times. He had been appalled by the inefficiency and the corruption, but he never really had stepped out before. Well, he just does a number on Smith. He just basically says this is unacceptable. This is the reason the city's in such trouble is because of waste, because of corruption, because of bad contracting, you name it. He just really takes out after him. And in itself, there wasn't anything new that was said, except there were two reporters in the audience. Pesky reporters. There were two reporters in the audience. One was from the Post, and one was from the Commercial, Cincinnati Commercial. And they reported the next day in their newspapers about this debate that took place, and they create the tagline, I just lost it. The shot heard round the wards, W-A-R-D-S. So again, you find an image that makes it work. Well, Seasongood, one of his points in this debate was that the whole history of the organization had been a blot on the city, but it wasn't just the financial and misuse of money that was the failure. It was the fact that the organization had in effect wreaked psychological damage on Cincinnati citizens by drugging them into a state of political lethargy. So he broadened this whole argument out. This wasn't just about money. This was about the undermining of citizenship. And what happens is then the Republican organization responds after this debate and calls Seasongood a political amateur who's performing the role of a Bolshevik. So this is after World War I, the Red Scare, and we've just gotten through the worst part of the Red Scare, but it's really there, and really that still hangs on now. You know, calling somebody a communist, it's just part of the American language. It means we don't like them. So anyway, Seasongood didn't go away. He challenges people. He says, I will debate anybody, any place who wants to. Now, this is a month before the election. The Republicans have gotten smart, and they said, we're not going to do that again. He issues 14 questions he wants to debate, and then they set up a whole series of community debates which no Republican shows up for. So he debates an empty chair. Okay? And in one case, the Chamber of Commerce, my former employer, set up a debate, but they refused to invite Seasongood. So it just compounds the whole problem. And basically, Seasongood becomes the spokesperson, the out front person, the face of reform in the city. And when the election takes place, the levy goes down to defeat, and pretty easily, pretty broad defeat of the city. Now, defeating the levy was one thing. It meant you starving the city, but it didn't change the governmental structure. It didn't change the dynamics of politics in Cincinnati. It just meant you had created more economic problems for the city as it existed. And what happened, here's a really interesting thing that happens. the people who are sort of revolving around the reform movement, they, including Season Good, they commission a study, but when it comes back, Season Good refuses to sign it because he doesn't think it's strong enough. And he announces he needs to focus on his professional and his personal life, that he can't be involved anymore. He's a reluctant leader in my category. You know, he's somebody who he's not looking to be out front. He just was very good at being out front. And he and his wife go to England for 2.5 months for a legal conference and then a vacation. During that time, other people step up. Henry Bentley of the Birdless Ballot League. How many of you have ever voted a birded ballot? My first ballot when I was 18 years old, because I grew up in northern Kentucky, I could vote in 1964. You walk in, and at the top of the machine, you had an eagle and a rooster. And if you wanted to vote the ticket, you didn't have to know how to read anything. You just hit a lever at the top, and all the other levers just went all the way down, and you'd vote at the straight party ticket, whichever party you wanted. So the urban reformers, progressive reformers, thought that was terrible. How could people be making intelligent decisions if they were just not even reading, they were just hitting the bird, and that was it. So the Birdless Ballot League, that's, you know, it's a term that I'm afraid if I just said it, nobody would think it was interesting or funny. Ed Alexander, who was a La Follette progressive, Agnes Wilson from the League of Women Voters. Remember, 1920, the 19th Amendment had passed, and women are now part of the political dynamic of the city. Marietta Tawney of the Women's City Club. And then a host of other people who what I refer to as second-rung leaders, and I write about in other essays I'm not going to go into today, but they're in the book. One of my favorite is Herbert Koch, who was a lawyer and a banker, who kept a diary his entire life. His mother kept it early on. His early entries are, today I learned to say dada, and it's like, what? But his mother kept it till he was 11. His wife kept it the last couple of months of his life as he was failing. I cannot find a day that he didn't enter anything into his diary. Plus, he kept a companion scrapbook filled with tens of thousands of photographs. His brother was a really great photographer. So anyway, this group works through what we know as the charter reform. The idea of a small, at-large council going from 32 seats to 9, voted at-large across the city, the mayor being just first among equals, elected by the majority of whoever was on the council gets elected. This is all modeled, as the judge talked about before, sort of scientific reform. This is trying to create a business model for the city where the council was the board of advisors, but then the key is, two keys. One, that the city was going to be run on a day-to-day basis by a professional, college-educated, not many college-educated people, probably 5% of the total population at that point, college-educated professional who was nonpartisan. Don't know his partisan affiliations, don't care. That was sort of the attitude. And then also, to create a more representative group, they adopted PR, proportional representation. And so those are the key elements of this reform that they then put together into the Charter of 1924, and they put out for a vote in November of 1924. 1924. Thank you. I knew something was wrong. 1924. Once again, although Season Good tried to step back, he's called back in to become the spokesperson for that campaign. And he's an effective spokesperson. The images of Cincinnatus and the image of the pothole are omnipresent in the race, and it passes with 70% of the vote. So we now have a new charter. Once again, after that vote, Season Good announces he's retiring from public life. He's going to concentrate on his legal career. He loves being a lawyer. He doesn't relish this public side of his career. And he thinks that the new charter ought to be implemented by the existing political parties. And everybody goes, yeah! That's not going to happen. It will just be undermined. And finally, they convinced Season Good to join the slate, the charter slate. He gets elected and then chosen the first mayor, serves 2 terms as mayor. So, and chooses the first city manager and whatever. So he is pulled back in again. So this whole idea of the reluctant leader, the person who has to be drawn in, not because he has political ambition, because he's good at what he does and he has principles, is just key to that whole charter reform. When the new charter gets elected in the fall of 1925 and then goes into office in January of 1926, and you look at those early city manager reports, one of the things that you'll find is there's a section about how many miles of streets have been repaved and how they've been repaved efficiently using asphalt. And sort of the phrase that gets developed is, by the Charterites, is there's no Republican or Democratic method to fix potholes, only an efficient or an inefficient method. And, you know, there's something about local politics that makes something like that work and something understandable. So what can we say about this sudden transformation of the city from October of 1923 until November of 1925? I mean, this is really rapid once it takes place. One of the things is, those of you who may get discouraged about the whatever the political environment is and whatever level of government you're worried about, there are forces at work just below the surface that the experts don't necessarily understand. They don't necessarily recognize that somehow that gestalt shift can take place very suddenly, and people on a broad basis can see the world from a very different point of view. So, some final thoughts. We talked about the role of third parties, another aspect of the charter movement. And I'm just talking about the origins of the party here today, but one of the amazing things about charter is that it doesn't disappear by 1938 or 1940. It becomes a part of the political environment of Cincinnati for at least 100 years, we'll just say, in this group, giving us the centennial. You can put a number on it. But part of that was because there was no functioning Democratic Party. In effect, in the early decades, charter, at least in the late 20s, the 30s, the 40s, until after World War II, there is no meaningful Democratic Party. So the charter, in effect, becomes the second party, which Americans are used to two-party choices. Okay, so that's part of what's going on. The other part, which I find even much more interesting, is that Charter has this fascinating commitment that it's all about city issues. It's about local good government. It's about local issues. And you can be a good Republican or a good Democrat in state and national issues and races and still be a Charterite. I mean, the classic example is Charlie Taft. You know, Charlie, who served in the course of his life 30 years on council, broken up in with a lot of different things. Charlie wrote a book and remember Charlie's family, the Tafts. He wrote a book in praise of Roosevelt, FDR, not TR, FDR. He worked for FDR. He ran for governor and got killed as a Republican. He could be a Republican statewide, nationally, but also run in the city as a Charterite. You also have people like Bobby Stern. Yeah, her sympathies are, I think I knew her well enough to say she was a Democrat, but she had no interest in ever moving beyond the city. She was totally committed to city issues. So ambition was not part of it. It was, yes, I will vote who I vote for in state and national issues because of what they stand for, but in terms of where my passion is, it's the local issues. It's being committed to Cincinnati. So that hyper focus on the importance of local issues is, I think, one of the things that is really interesting in light of the tradition in American politics that local and states are the laboratories for democracy. Things start locally and are experimented with, and then they bubble up to higher levels. My worry is that at the moment, we've turned that on its head. And all of the issues are being dictated from the top down. So school boards, library boards, whatever, they all of a sudden are feeling the heat, not from the local constituency left by to its own, but by the national politics. And it's very difficult to understand how local reform efforts play their traditional role in American life. That worries me at the moment. Now, that's all I got for today. I read the book for other things, but I do want to say I originally intended to take this into how the Charter tried to spread, at least through the county, and reform the county on several different occasions, beginning in 1934, and made again in the late 60s, then the early 70s. There were efforts to reform county government in the model of the good government model of Charter, and that is a really fascinating story. And one of the essays that I really enjoyed, because it was all new to me, was the history of the Lingle Commission in the 1970s. I mean, it was a reform effort that should have worked and didn't. And why? What were the forces at work there? It was headed by a vice president of P&G who had national political experience. He had all these things going for him, and the whole thing falls apart and blows up. So, you know, there are other things about Charter that I've written, but I thought that was enough for today. So, questions, thoughts, throw things at me. I don't care. I was a high school teacher. My experience is that high school, if you're in a high school room and somebody's not asking you a question, one of two things have happened. You've lost them, or they're plotting against you. And I've had both of those happen in my high school classrooms. Yes?
Are you aware of any other reform movements in other cities in the country that have the hyper-focus on local issues?
Maybe other people can address that. I am not.
Galveston, Texas.
I'm sorry, what?
Galveston, Texas.
Galveston, Texas?
After the hurricane. It's where the city manager model evolved.
Is it because they have a city manager form of government, or is it because they have this sort of hyper-local focus?
They had a disaster that triggered fresh thinking.
Okay. All right. I don't know enough about that to say anything.
I wonder if that's what is responsible for the longevity of Charter. And
Oh,
Charter is unique.
I think there's no doubt about that.
And I wonder, in Galveston, did that movement continue, or did it just last for a couple of cycles?
It took place about the same time, but just you call it recovery. It was triggered by a disaster, and the response to the disaster was a disaster. And we need fresh thinking.
Yeah. Question?
I'm wondering if there are parallels with the Committee of 500 that existed in Fort Thomas that cleaned up Newport.
Well, I grew up in northern Kentucky. Somebody asked to repeat the question?
Repeat the question.
Okay. Could you just speak up?
I'm wondering if there are parallels with the Committee of 500 that existed over in Fort Thomas that cleaned up Newport.
Yeah, I grew up in Kenton County. Now, the Licking can be just as wide as the Ohio. My father wouldn't let us go to Campbell County, you know. My father also wouldn't let us, I mean, we're Catholic, wouldn't let us go to bingo games. He was convinced they were controlled by the mob. So things happen, you know, this is all related to the cleaning up of northern Kentucky in the 50s and 60s. I don't know what sort of interaction there might have been. I'm pretty much amazed at how little interaction there is on a political level across that Ohio River. I mean, think about a few years ago with the Airport Board, which is the Kenton County Airport Board, by the way. Kenton County owns the airport in Boone County. It was in Boone County because there were more cows than people in Boone County at the time. Nobody cared about Boone County. But it's controlled by the Kenton County Board. And there was always pressure to put some Cincinnatians on that board. After all, who was flying out and who were the business interests that were committed? And at one point, this is back maybe 15 years ago, I remember somebody saying, we really looked for somebody who was capable of being on the Kenton County Airport Board. We couldn't find anybody. From Ohio. We couldn't find anybody. So, you know, I don't know enough about the Committee of 500 to respond to that. But I'm not confident there would have been a lot of exchange. Yes?
Could you tie in the role of civil service into your context?
Oh, absolutely. One of the basic principles of Charter was to introduce civil service. That's another piece of the 24 Charter. And it was implemented, and it was, you know, we've got to have civil service based on qualifications and protection of workers once they're in those slots from political shenanigans. That was a fundamental part, not just of Charter, but of progressive reform. It was the 19th century, statewide, nationally, locally, where the spoils system worked, going all the way back to the 1830s and 40s, starting with Andrew Jackson. The spoils, trying to put spoils in so that the winners get to run things. So this was part, any of the early 20th century reform movements absolutely were committed to civil service. Dot.
It's my understanding that Covington has just thrown out their city manager form of government in the last election, and I'm wondering what you think about that.
I don't know.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, the question was that the understanding is that Covington has just thrown out city manager form of government, and what's my reaction. Not running newsmakers anymore and not staying on top of every election like I used to. If you'd asked me that 5 years ago, I think I would have had a good response. I don't know enough about what the dynamics are over there. I remember being asked, probably, it was after I guess I was still at Channel 12. I was at Channel 12 till 2019. 2018, and I was asked to moderate a debate in Covington for their commission, and it was really hard for me to figure out what was going on. I had to do a lot of study to try to understand not just what the party structure was, but what the issues were and what divided people and what people were concerned about. So I don't know that. Does anybody else follow that race over in Covington this year? I knew it happened, but I don't know what to say about it. Other questions?
Yeah. So I'm curious, in my time, the big charter reform was in around 2000, I'm sorry, with the kind of moving away from the leader among equals to a stronger mayor system. Are there kind of two-part? I'm curious, is that a failing of the charter, and have there been other charter reformations before that maybe I'm not aware of?
Well, I'm sorry, what?
Can you repeat the question?
Repeat the question. The efforts in the early 2000s to move away from the weak mayor being elected by the 9 members of council, being primarily a ceremonial mayor who cut ribbons, but who ran the council sessions, but trying to move towards a directly elected mayor, well, first a top vote getter and then directly elected, which began to be called a strong mayor, which I think is a misnomer.
A stronger mayor is what I mean.
Well, that's not what people say. You're too sophisticated. People say that about you all the time. I don't think we have a strong mayor system. We don't have an executive mayor. Okay. We still have a city manager. A city manager is really important. I have to tell you, at certain low points in my political career, I worked for Tom Luken in 1976. I ran the field operation for his congressional race. And I had not been involved. I got into politics in 1968 as an anti-war, civil rights, came clean for Gene McCarthy, committed to that. And then I worked for a series of losers, and but really good people, and for causes that were really important to me. Okay, we always lost. Luken was the first person who had a chance to win, and we won by a half a vote per precinct. I mean, it was a tight race in 1976. Being around Luken, now this is Tom, I suddenly realized how much he hated charter. I had no idea how, and I don't know how representative he was of the Democratic Party in general, but Tom absolutely hated charter and had no use for it at all. So then you get to Charlie, and Charlie's sort of, and I've said all this stuff to Charlie to his face, so I'm not speaking out of turn. Charlie's Luken light. You can't not like Charlie. I mean, but as a person, you can't not like Charlie. But he also had no use. And, wanted top vote getter. And as long as it was top vote getter, my joke with Charlie was, well, you're mayor for life. You can be mayor for as long as you want to be because you're going to win the damn race. But even that wasn't enough. And so then we wanted to have direct election of the mayor. I think that what we end up with now is a confused situation. What's the role of the manager and what's the role of the mayor? I don't think they're as clearly defined as they historically have been, and I think that's problematic. Now, no matter what the structures are, the people who are in the structures have tremendous influence on how things operate. So let's not think, oh, if we had just done this, it would have all been fine. No. I mean, anybody can operate within any structure in a good or bad way. So, you know, everybody can have their own opinions about whether the current mayor or the last mayor or whatever was good, bad, or indifferent. I find it awkward at the moment. I mean, city manager form of government has served us very well for an awful long time. So I have a high level of respect for that. And I am loath to mess with that system because I think you can get yourself into trouble. I don't know.
Has there been any other attempts to reform the charter before that?
Oh, yeah. Well, PR was eliminated in 1957 because Republicans hated it from the beginning, but the fear was that Ted Berry was going to sort of was next in line for mayor, and they didn't want that, so they go to the 9X system. And then when we get the Charter Democratic Coalition in the early 1970s, we change mayors every year. What does that say? You know, we'll have one charter rate this year and a Democrat next year, and it says this isn't a very important role. All that did is, in my mind, all that did was sort of undercut the dignity of the office. I'm not talking about power, I'm talking about dignity there. Question in the back.
I think it's ironic that we're discussing civil service here in a room overlooking Garfield Park. Garfield was assassinated shortly after he was elected by a person who felt that he deserved a political appointment. Garfield refused to give him that appointment.
He was also nuts.
Shortly after that, after Garfield's death, the Pendleton Act was enacted that created civil service. I just think it's ironic.
Yeah, and by the way, I love this room. This is the tower room, and I made sure every year, once a year, and when I ran Leadership Cincinnati, we were in this room. So if you have never been in this room, maybe we can pull the shades up later, and you look down here, and you see the steeples of Second Presbyterian, of Isaac Wise Temple, Plum Street Temple, of City Hall, of St. Peter and Chains. I mean, the tower, this is just a gorgeous view. And one of my favorite places, and when I do a bus tour or something, one of my favorite stops is 8th and Plum. And I tell people, and I'm serious about this, 8th and Plum. Okay. I'll go down to 8th and Plum a couple times a year. And my commitment is to sit on a different set of steps each time and think about the question of democracy, but the question particularly about religion and politics from various perspectives. I'm trained as an early American, late 18th, early 19th century historian with a focus on religious experience. I'm a religious, that's my background in my doctoral work at William and Mary. So I'm very interested in the role of religion in American life. And there's no better corner. Now, I wish First Unitarian Church was still there, not just for architectural reasons, but, I mean, it was a beautiful building, but the relationship of that congregation with Plum Street Temple is fascinating because there were interchanges going back and forth. And I always say, I cannot find any interchange from that side of the street over to St. Peter and Chains. And that didn't work. So anyway, before you leave here, if you don't know this room, make sure you look outside. Other questions? Yes.
Two questions. How long did Murray Seasongood stay active in politics? How many years? Because you were saying he was reluctant. And the second question is, how good was the first city manager? He must have been pretty good because of the fact that he did have to reform quite a bit, make many changes. And how long did he last?
I don't remember that answer. Does anybody know how long Cheryl lasted?
I think it was about 4 years, and he was recruited elsewhere.
Yeah, he was an engineer. All the early city managers were engineers, because engineers run things. It's before you really get the whole concept of public administration as a formal area of study in universities. So who are you going to hire? Well, engineers know how to run things. Yes, question, answer, whatever.
But part of Kevin's question had to do with what he accomplished, and what he accomplished, I think, was miraculous in terms of paving streets and improving efficiency.
Right. And if you look at those early reports, it's so laid out as to the program that he was committed to, and the early councils were committed to.
And how long was Murray Seasongood?
He served 2 terms and he was finished.
Done?
Yeah, he never ran again, as far as I know, for anything. He continued to write and speak around the country about political reform and political principles, but he was not active in elective politics. By the way, and given what we're going through right now, I have a real commitment to being careful about the way the term politics is used, because it's become a dirty word. In my mind, we should all learn to use the difference between politics and partisanship. Politics is the process by which we work through what policies we stand for, what principles we stand on, what values we hold. Partisanship is loyalty to a particular political organization, and it can be good, bad, or indifferent, but they're different. So when people say, oh, such and such a thing, it became political, it's not bad that it became political. It's bad when it becomes partisan. And, what we're after is who gets the win. That's not the question. That should rarely be the question. Although practical politicians, you have to answer that question. Yes?
So what do you see as the future of the Charter Committee in supporting effective civil service?
Steve Gooden can answer all of those questions. I'm not active as a charterite. I've never been. Of course, I get to hide behind 36 years in the press, and therefore I couldn't be active in electoral politics. Since I retired, I now run a poll every year for elections. But I'm not active with Charter. My wife at one time was on the Charter board for I don't know, 1 term, whatever that means. And I know I've stood in the rain for Bobby Stern and Tom Brush. I can remember the 1985 election. Poured down rain. I think I changed clothes 3 times that day, passing out, working outside. And, I think it's going to be interesting to see. Steve was saying that in 2025 you're going to roll out a new sort of energy and vision. I'm anxious to see what that is. I'm not in on those secrets. I'll document it later. Was there another? Yes.
Proportional representation was killed in 57.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a possibility of its return, a need for it?
Well,
if it is, would the charter play a role?
Well, you know, if you study proportional representation or ranked choice voting, there's slight differences, but essentially the same thing. You can make a darn good argument for those as a way of getting a more diverse representation, especially on a multi-seat board like a council, a city council. The problem, I mean, one of the problems with proportional representation that was put in 1925, or in 1924 by the charter, was it, I don't know, how many of you know how it really worked physically, okay? You take all the ballots, first off, people went into the polling booth, and if I'm a candidate, if I'm Charlie Taft, I pass out slips that say, vote for me first, and vote for fill in the blank. He would choose somebody second, Ted Berry. Okay, he would support somebody. Most of those campaign ballots had just two people. All right, so you then went into the polling place, you ranked your votes. All those ballots were taken. They were taken down to like the Sinton Hotel or where it was a ballroom. They're all laid out on tables. And over here, Charlie Taft has a stack about this big. And over here, the 18th person who was running, he and his mother voted for him. So first off, you got rid of people who were never going to, what you need was 1/10 of the vote plus one, because we're electing 9 people. So you get rid of the people who are, they're not going anywhere. But you don't just throw them away. You see who they vote for second. You put them in their piles. Now over here, Charlie's got 3 times the number of votes that he needs. So we go through that pile and we literally pull out every third vote. And we look at randomly. And we look at what's on there and we redistribute it to the number 2 vote. And then you declare Charlie the winner and whatever. So this was all done in public. People could go in and watch the count go on. But here are people handling the ballots. It doesn't look good. Today, we run things by computers. All of that could be done a lot quicker and a lot easier. So I think it's Oregon, isn't it?
Alaska,
Maine.
It is used in places, and I think it could be much more efficient. But of course, what you then run into is all the people who are raising questions about voter fraud, and the machines are going to be tampered with, and the program's going to be changed, and you voted for. We're in a very bad environment to be talking about this. But at least we're not in the environment where people are actually physically picking things out of a pile and moving them someplace. That just raised questions, even if it was done perfectly. It didn't feel right. Now, in fact, from a mathematical point of view, it made a lot of sense. So there's all sorts of defenses of it and justifications of it. Okay, one more question? Yes.
I have an observation, I think. It's a revisionist history.
There's only revisionist history. There is no other thing.
Mr. Seasongood promoted the movement with the defeat of the levy because of bad financial management, and that's what he was remembered for. But now with the subway being in the media, and younger people who don't know the whole story, well, they blame Murray Seasongood because we don't have a subway system in Cincinnati, not realizing we were on the verge of financial collapse.
Well, the subway's a whole other story. The short version is, you had to grow up in northern Kentucky to understand this. I grew up with 2 stories. They both began, those stupid Cincinnatians. Those stupid Cincinnatians built a subway, then they went out to buy the rolling stock and found out the tubes were too small and no car would fit in. It's not true, but it sounds good. Those stupid Cincinnatians built a subway, they ran a test run, they found out the curves were too sharp and the cars fell off. That's not true either. But the point is that the money to build what is called the subway, it was really the rapid transit system, it was only a part of it was underground. It was passed in 1911. Once World War I takes place, you can't build anything during World War I. And after the war you do it, you don't have enough money to do it. But the political gang that controlled the city, they never met a dollar they didn't want to spend, or maybe had already spent. And consequently, the subway becomes another symbol for the charter candidates and the charter movement to attack. And they really went after it. And once they won, it was dead. Now, the question is, would it have, there's other reasons it didn't work. And we could get into that. There's a really good book. Who's?
Jake Mecklenburg?
Yes, Jake Mecklenburg's book. That really does cover what happened there, and I would recommend that book. Okay, I said one more, but I hate to.
So the charter set up the various commissions, the Park Board, Planning Commission, and the Cincinnati Recreation Commission, which were independent bodies that made recommendations to City Council, and they had staff that reported directly to them, namely the directors. In the 80s, a city lawsuit that was filed by a city employee ended up in a settlement that resulted in the director of city planning, who reported to the Planning Commission, then being, that was changed so that the planning director would report directly to the city manager. And the settlement had nothing to do with the original case, but I think politically there was something going on there. That has changed, I think, significantly. The independence of the planning department and the planning commission has changed things as much as maybe the argument of strong mayor versus city manager form of government. Can you talk about that?
Not much, which is good news to all of you. I don't disagree with you. I think it's even more complicated than that. Something like the Park Board existed long before 1925 or 26. There's much more history here than you just sketched out. Secondly, these relationships of these autonomous boards is fraught with difficulties. And it's not just a simple problem. I think actually the question about planning, which charter, by the way, was totally committed to planning. The planning function really comes in with charter. Charter is committed to that. So, not that there wasn't planning on going on ahead. I mean, the Kessler Plan of 1907, the City Plan of 1925, Charter didn't really do those. But Charter took planning and made it something that they were totally committed to and that Cincinnati was a leader in. I think you're better off, if you want to see some change, focusing on the planning stream and who's responsible for what and where the control is than trying to get into parks and recreation. I think that's a morass that in the long run, planning, in my mind, as a former adjunct in the School of Planning, I think planning is much more important. And I would encourage you to focus on that and try to figure out where you want to go from here.
There was a super department where there was one head and all the other departments, engineering, architecture, planning, all were under that umbrella. Now they're very separate silos, and there's not a lot of coordination between transportation and zoning.
you clearly know a lot about this, and I don't want to step into something I really don't know about. Just being honest, I don't know enough about that. I know that there was a new city plan that was developed, I don't know, about 10 years ago, and then just sort of disappeared when John Cranley came into office. Just ignored it. And
It didn't have really specific recommendations.
Well,
It's nothing like the 48 plan.
oh, no, well, nothing's like the 48 plan. And by the way, if anybody in this room has not read the 1948 Metropolitan Master Plan, that's your homework. You can't understand modern Cincinnati if you don't understand the 1948 Metropolitan Master Plan. It's only 18 volumes, but it's really big print, and there are lots of pictures and illustrations. So that is your homework between now and Christmas. Thank you very much.